Good morning. It's good to be here. Get the switch. Yeah, the opportunity to be back is not always something we get the chance to do after we do a retreat or a working time, and so it's really awesome. And the neatest thing is the fact that Tim and Denise are here. I've known Tim for, I think it's, God, we're just going to say 40 years. I don't know if that's the truth, but somewhere in there. Anyway, it's been a journey that we've been on together for a long time, and it's really an honor to be here, and I am so thrilled for you guys to be able to be with Tim and Denise and the ministry opportunities that they bring wherever they go. And I just hope so much that the wisdom and the combined abilities in this area, you guys are going to see some amazing things happen. I know that. Tim said you guys have been looking at the book of Luke lately and working through that, and it's kind of a new thing. And I was like, well, can I do Luke 4? Because I can really mess that up really good. I've gotten really proficient at messing Luke 4 up, hopefully in a good way. Hopefully, like the title says, is that my wife and I don't have to run out of here because you try to kill us. That's the truth. Think about how many of you guys have ever taught Bible class, little kid Bible class. Raise your hand if you ever taught at that or been in one. You've been there, and did you ever hear a Bible story and the first thing you thought was, I need to kill that teacher? It's not common. I'm really glad none of you said yes, but that happened. Can you imagine teaching 2 Bible stories and the reaction is, I need to kill you? And it's not just one person that thinks that. It's the combined consensus of everyone that just heard you teach the Bible lesson. You should die now. That sounds odd, doesn't it? Especially when you started out in a way that people would have been the normal good day at church. I didn't mention it happened to church. It happened at church that a Bible too, well, and not even, they really weren't even like hard Bible lessons. They were just some of the good ones, you might say. But the writer of Luke records this. It's this incident that happened. It happened not completely centered around the verse that Tim read, but more about the part of the verse that's not read in Luke. And we've seen this. It's in Luke chapter 4, starting around verse 13, that Jesus is teaching, and he's been, probably, I would say, one of the better weeks of his life. Maybe because the first few days were not so great when he'd been out in the desert with no food. That might not have been very fun. And he'd been going through some temptations and some struggles, but when he comes back, it's the first thing he says, he returned in the power of the Spirit. That sounds great. That's like coming home from a retreat. That's like coming home from that great time that I survived and everything was great. He comes back and the news about him was spreading throughout the countryside. It's good. It's good. Jesus is on a roll. This is what he was here for. He taught in their synagogues and he was praised by everyone. That's not a bad thing. You can't see to where that beginning is going to end in near death, can you? It doesn't seem that would be the ending of the story when it begins with that reflection of that Luke had found out when he was possibly researching, hey, tell us that time when. Tell me about that. But then it says that Jesus went to Nazareth where he had been raised. That's not a bad thing. That sounds pretty good. And on the Sabbath, he went to the synagogue as he normally did and stood up to read. This was pretty common. You have a couple of roles here that are normally played in a synagogue of worship. The reader, and then kind of like the interpreter, the explainer would be the second role. The first one was both very honorable positions. Both of these roles are going to be played by Jesus this day. He gets to do the dual thing. I say it, to me, it's kind of like when the youth group preaches on Sunday night. You know, they do the sermon and they do the song leading and they do everything. And when I was in youth ministry, when you had those special nights, you like give them the verse. You know, the kids that are going to stand up and read, you want them to read the verse or tell the story that everybody goes, that's the verse. Good job. It's the verse that you give if you're going to put it on a sign today, you put John 3:16 right and I'm going to say this, the Broncos score a touchdown because I'm from Denver. The Broncos score a touchdown and you hold it up in the end zone, John 3:16. Everybody's like, yes, that's it. That's the verse. That's our verse. We love that verse. I didn't say the Cowboys scored a touchdown because that doesn't happen as often as the Broncos scoring a touchdown. So the Broncos score a touchdown, John 3:16. We hold it up. It's a great thing. If you had that back then, they would have put the verse that Tim read on that placard. That was the home run verse. If you're going to stand up in a synagogue and the guy handed you a scroll and it was Isaiah, you're like, I got this. And you just unroll it right there to that one and you read that one. And everybody would go, that's our boy. Good job. And then the next position is the orator would stand up and tell you about it. And that was, you would go, man, if you were going to talk about a verse, that verse out of Isaiah, that's the one. And so he found it. He says, he unrolled the scroll in verse 17, and he says, and he found the place where it's written. So you can picture Jesus. I mean, I just like push buttons on my iPad, but he's unrolling. It's in 61, so he's like, it might have taken a while to unroll that baby. And he gets over to 61. Oh, there it is. And actually he's rolling this way and he's reading this way. He's reading backwards to us and he's reading this part. So he would read along, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. And right then people say, I know what he's reading. Because the Lord has anointed me. You can almost picture their mouths kind of mouthing the words as he's doing this. He has sent me to preach good news to the poor. Oh man, this is going to be good. To proclaim the release of the prisoners and recover the sight of the blind. To liberate the oppressed. To proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Starts re-rolling. Now that would be curious. And at that point, it's probably whoever was supposed to be the orator that day was glad that Jesus handed it back and then went and sat down. He left out the best part. He stopped too soon. That would have raised every eyebrow. What's he doing? That moment would have been a moment in the synagogue when it would have went from maybe a hustle to a what? What's he going to say now? Do you catch the part that he stopped with? The vengeance of the Lord stopped. That's the part they all liked. That was the good part. The other parts were just signs leading up to the climactic solution of their problem. You see, they all had a problem there in Nazareth. They had a big problem. Their problem was a Caesar, not the salad. Their problem was an army. Their problem, when they traveled to Jerusalem, there were new guard towers occupied by Roman soldiers. There were folks that looked at them and said, you're not as good as we are. Even though you have your puppet king and your puppet governments, we're still in charge. It was that verse for this people that said, God is going to get you. We know because we know God. You don't. And we also know that God is on our side, not yours. Because you are bad. You are not the beloved. You see, they had some really big categories. You were Jew or you were Gentile. You were the other. That's it. I don't care what you defined yourself of. If you were not Jewish, you were everything else. Gentile. It's the us and the them. One day God will come and lift us up and wipe out the them. That's what we wanted. And Jesus didn't read it. Apparently, on purpose. So, it rolls up the scroll, sat back down. Every eye in the synagogue was fixed on him, probably not gently. You ever been in a room where every eye is fixed on you? It might have just been you and your mom. Or that moment it was you and your dad. And all of his eyes were fixed right on you. And you can feel them. It wasn't in hopeful anticipation of what they were going to give Jesus. The translators kind of have a problem here in this area. You can read a lot about it. Is that Jesus is going to start talking, and he says he began to explain to them, which they would have said, you have a lot of explaining to do. Why did you leave that out? Today the scripture has been fulfilled just as you heard it. I like the way the contemporary English brings that out. You heard it right. I didn't say the vengeance of the Lord. You heard me right. And it's been fulfilled just like you heard it. Has been. Now, the King James Version says they all kind of cast their eyes on Jesus. The other translations kind of struggle with some of the original language here, and it kind of comes out as they praise him. Everyone was raving about Jesus, so impressed that they were by his gracious words. That is a stretch, I'm afraid. As I've read this, it doesn't fit the context. And often, this is when it gets confusing for us as we teach this part of the Bible lesson, because it's like, well, they were so happy. Why'd they get so mad? But it was more likely they were a little bit still curious of what is going on, and their gracious words were more... Anybody ever kind of been nice, but you can kind of tell they're not really being super nice? You ever had those words used? It's like, good job there. We liked that. And it's like, they didn't really like that. That's more what was probably going on at this moment. And so Jesus answers him back. He says, undoubtedly you're going to quote to me, well, Doctor, heal yourself. Do here in your hometown what you've heard and you did in Capernaum. He said, I assure you that no prophet is welcome in the prophet's hometown. Okay? That probably didn't win a lot of friends and influence people. So he's going to tell them what's going on. Have you ever been in the situation where someone used a word from your past, but the way they used it meant totally different? I mean, that's growing up. These first couple of pews here mostly probably could use a vocabulary, and the rest of us would be going, I have no idea what they just said. Because if they're using words that now mean something that don't mean what we used to use them for, and they would probably be shocked to find out that as we went through the pews, you had the same experience with people different age than you. And it passed on. They're like, no, we're the one. No, and then you said, no, when I was a teenager, we used to say this, and man, and my parents got mad. Don't talk like that in my house. And you're like, it doesn't mean anything bad. And you went on. It's just they do it with their thumbs now, and we used to do it with our mouths. And so that kind of could be what was going on here, right? Maybe Jesus just doesn't understand the language, and he's teaching them something. But what if what Jesus is getting ready to do is actually going to reshape their very concept of God? Not just words, more than just people, but God himself. What if they're going to realize that's what he's doing? How big of a chance is that? That Jesus could actually reshape their understanding of God and point to the fact that his ministry, what he's getting ready to do, is all about that. Using words of their past to help them understand, you probably didn't get the whole concept. Could that split a church? Yeah. Could that cause conflict even with people you were raised with? Yeah. Could people even say that wasn't right for Jesus to do that? Yeah. It was a tough situation, but he's getting ready to do it. He's getting ready to do it in his own hometown. He's going to start some of his ministry here with reshaping a definition of God. In the ministry that I get to work with and the friends that I work among every day, one of the quick things we learned was the need to redefine the word Christian. And how sad that was. The definition of the very word Christian and what that meant to our friends was not pretty. Christians were seen as people that had an agenda that didn't always have my best interest at heart. Christianity often meant the way I was treated by even a family member that called themselves a Christian on Saturday night was not healthy for me in many ways. And then they drugged me to a church on Sunday and acted totally different. Christian meant the man that stood downtown Denver with a giant sign that said, Jesus saves. And when our friends walked down the streets with their backpacks and being a homeless young teenager, would have that sign literally smashed towards their face and just held like, you have to do this. And the kid just almost like having to back away from that Christian message. It scared them. And we spent years, and still do often, to try to redefine this, saying that's not what a follower of Christ does. And it's hard. And the hardest part is, I understand why they think that way. And then sadly, often, I've felt that way. I have felt more oppressed or seen, I don't know what it was, even the way I acted. And I haven't lived or had the history and the knowledge of a lot of these folks. The concepts that you guys have of God, of who God is, think about, where did that come from? When you think of God and you think of who God is and what role He plays in your life, and we would have over 100 different answers in this room alone. We would have some commonalities that would help us stay in unity in this room and working, but we probably all wouldn't be the same. And that's okay. But there might be a few points that we would go, that's too far. Don't go there. I don't know. Maybe that's something that's gone on. But what if the very concept, the root of who God is, changed or was spoken of differently? Is that hard? That's what Jesus is getting ready to do. Jesus is the difference. He acts differently than their concept. The way He lived on earth. Later, the writer in Hebrews will say, Jesus is the very character and essence of God. Jesus will say of Himself, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. If you're in me and I'm in you and we are in God Himself. Paul will say that Jesus is the very image of the invisible God. They didn't mean that just lightly. He is that. If you know Christ, the way He acts, the way He treats people, the way He loves, then you know how God loves. There's no exception. You don't get to divide God up and make Him multiple personalities and have all these different concepts of how God is going to act towards this group of people and this group of people and me. Because the only way you can define the way God is going to act towards people is how did Jesus act towards all people. That's God. I want to tell you straight up, if you do that, it may get you killed. It likely will get you killed. Maybe not rocks thrown at you, but people that don't agree with that concept may just walk away from you. But I will promise you, people that need to know that love will flock towards you. So Jesus goes on in this, and he is standing there, and he said, I assure you no prophet is welcome in his own hometown, and I can assure you that there were many widows in Israel during Elijah's time. So he goes to one of the big boys, Elijah. And the story you remember is the widow of Zarephath. Zarephath was not Jewish. The widow was not your good Jewish Israelite widow. So she's in her town, and Elijah walks in. You remember the story? She is, hey, what are you doing, lady? Oh, I'm picking up the last few sticks and got a little bit of flour and a little bit of oil. I'm going to go make this meal for my son and I. We're going to die. Well, great. Have a good day. If you just were Jewish, you'd be all right. Nope. That's not what he said. He said, ma'am, make me a meal as well. Sir, I don't have but just a little bit. He said, feed me. And I can promise you this. You'll never run out of flour. You'll never run out of oil till it rains again. 3.5 years there'd been no rain. She was literally down to her last scoop of flour. So this widow lady does this. She goes and she makes this last little bread meal, serves it to Elijah the prophet and her son, and never went without flour or oil. So Jesus asked him, he says, surely, there were many widows in Israel during that time. Yet God sent Elijah to Zarephath. You can hear the breath in that synagogue. But he didn't stop there. He said, and maybe you remember Elisha. That was big prophet number 2, right? And he said, you remember Elisha. He was the prophet. And he said, there were so many people with skin diseases in Israel during the time of Prophet Elijah. It was like common. If you would hear, think of how many times you would hear, unclean, unclean, as they walked, unclean, as they walked through the city to tell people, don't get around me. I've got, my skin's falling off of my body. I have leprosy. Unclean, unclean, unclean. He said, you know there was a lot of that going on in Israel, right? But Elisha didn't cleanse them. Instead, he went over to the Syrian Naaman. Naaman. Now, Naaman wasn't just your normal, maybe we could go, well, I understand taking care of a widow. It's all right. But Naaman? Do you know who Naaman was? Naaman was a commander of an army that wanted to kill the Israelites. The fact that your enemy had leprosy should be a good thing, and it might even be so good that you're like, look, God's getting you. Look what God did. God is punishing you with leprosy, Naaman. Yet God sends Elisha to Naaman, and you know the story, dip and get yourself cleansed in Naaman. How many of you have taught the story of Naaman in a Bible class? Right? I'm glad you're still alive. Because when he did this, it says when they heard this, everyone in the synagogue was filled with anger. They rose up and ran him out of the town. They led him to the crest of the hill on which their town had been built so they could throw him off the cliff. That didn't match their year of Jubilee. That was the verse that Tim read about. Jubilee had nothing to do with healing of our enemies. That's not how God works. God is not like that. Yet they were presented with absolute, unrefutable evidence that they were wrong about God. And they realized, I believe, that standing before them, being fulfilled in their presence, was exactly what they had heard that day. That their concept of the vengeance of the Lord was not correct. That what was being presented them at the beginning of this ministry was the very thing they did not want to hear. Later it will be said, I tell you this, love your enemies. Love those people who persecute you. Jesus said, that's the way I did it. That's the way you're going to do it. That's the way God is. Are we ready to hear that today? Or do we have concepts in our mind of who it is that we would love the vengeance of the Lord to come on? You don't have to listen in the newspapers very long. You don't have to hear the words of people around us. Pick out who it is that we really wish the Lord would come and get. Or that we would wish the Lord would happen to come now so that this doesn't happen. Let me tell you, that's not how God works. What I've found out working over the last 15 years that I didn't learn in seminary and places, that wasn't taught to me, that wasn't something that was pounded in my head as a teenager and a young person growing up in a church, that I want to proclaim, that I get to proclaim every day on the streets of Denver. God is not a monster. And that, my friends, is good news. God is not a monster God who you have to worry has a secret agenda that is going to take you out at the knees. He doesn't. And He sent Jesus to a place just like this. He sent Jesus to a situation to say, they've heard stories of me. They've told stories. Can you imagine God sitting there saying, they're telling stories of me and people don't understand it. They have the wrong idea of who I am. They don't realize that I've loved the widow from Zarephath, that I loved the Syrian commander, Naaman. They don't realize I've poured out my blessings over all people so that they will know one thing about me. I'm not a monster. And He says to His people, please love one another so that they know something. They know who you're disciples of. He says, please love one another. Love your enemies so that people will believe that it was God that sent Jesus. In John 17, He says, Lord, please help them be united together so that they will know that people, their words hear, that they'll say, well, you were sent from God. Why would they not recognize that Jesus was sent from God? Because I think, it seems to me, that the way Jesus acted and said, hey, I'm God, is not the way they viewed God. So how could a mean monster God send this beautiful, loving Jesus? And Jesus is praying, please, when they hear your words, let them know one thing, that God sent me. That's our goal. That's what we do. We have the beautiful privilege to pass this good news on. We get to, yes, challenge ourselves daily with our concept of God. I believe as you travel through the book of Luke, you're going to see people that are battling that same thing with you. You're going to watch people consider how they've known about God, for some of them, through thousands of years of story, and then standing before them is Jesus. And He's saying, you've seen me, you see God. And they either had a choice, you're not God, or wow, I repent of my old view of God, and I claim that one. I claim that view of God. Because it's not going to be long, even in the book of Luke, where he shows us what it looks like. And it looks like getting on a cross. It looks like hanging there and looking at God and saying, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. How would that verse, with the concept of God's love in your heart, change this week for you? If you looked at your spouse or your children or in yourself in the mirror and you said, Father, forgive. They don't know what they're doing. Isn't it time that a church gathered together and gave humanity the same break that Jesus gave to the ones that were killing him? Isn't it time that we said, hey, the good news is we forgive you and we realize you don't even know what you're doing. And we still forgive you. What would it look like in Lufkin, Texas, if this church decided to be the church that said, we just forgive everybody. And we realize you don't know what you're doing. We love you. How would it change this congregation? How would it change your family? How would it change your heart to have a different concept of God? Most of all, how would it change your relationship with God if you're able to say, you do love me? You're not trying to, you don't have there's no shoe to drop. It's not coming. You've proven that on the cross. How would it feel to stand up and say, you love me? One of my favorite drawings is by a man named David Hayward. And I have a picture of it in my office. And it's a hand holding a daisy. It's like this. And on that daisy is one petal. And the inscription says, it starts with, he loves me. And once you pull that one off, there is no, he loves me not. It starts and ends with one petal. He loves me. That's good news. That's what you guys, that I have to offer to everyone you meet. It starts with he loves me. That builds friendships. That builds kingdoms. That changes concepts of God. When you hear people say, well, where's God with all this violence going on, with all this struggle? He's forgiving because he knows they don't know what they're doing. He's not a gotcha God. He is no monster. Kids, he's not a monster. I promise you that. And it thrills my heart to know that I can sit here and say, guys, these guys aren't trying to teach you about a monster God. They're teaching you about a God who loves every one of you. That's Luke chapter 4. It is the ministry of Christ. It is the ministry of Central Church. Let's pray. Father, thank you for today. Thank you for loving us and showing us ways that we can be your hands, your feet, the good news in this town, in this earth, everywhere we go. Father, continue to bless us with your presence and bless us with the reality of who you are through the image and the knowledge of Jesus Christ. Father, help us to be that image as we walk among the people that you put us.